Hi, welcome back to a Mooc BHS130 Anatomy and Physiology 1. We have come to the next section of the respiratory system part 2. So today we are going deeper into the respiratory system. Are you ready? Let's move on. For this session, let's look into the learning outcome. At the end of this session, the students will be able to describe two things today: breathing mechanism and gas transport. Breathing mechanism. The breathing mechanism involves two main processes known as the inspiration, or in layman term is known as inhalation, and expiration, known also as exhalation. In this diagram, you will see there are two mechanisms here, inspiration and expiration, and involves different structures. And we're going to discuss further what happened during inspiration and during expiration. Firstly, we need to know there are pressure changes during inhalation and exhalation. The relationship between intrapulmonary pressure and atmospheric pressure determines the direction of airflow. The intrapleural pressure maintains the pull on the lungs. The pressure in the space between parietal and visceral pleura and intrapleural pressure must always be lower than the alveolar pressure that prevents the alveolar from collapsing. Here is a picture to show to you the pleura, parietal pleura and visceral pleura, which I have actually discussed with you in the previous section. And here I want to show to you that the intrapleural pressure here is the pressure between the two pleura. Okay, and the pleura is intrapleural pressure is actually less than the atmospheric pressure, and therefore the air will go inside the lungs later on. Pulmonary ventilation. What is pulmonary ventilation? The physical movement of air into and out of the lungs. This pulmonary ventilation depends on de Boyle's law. De Boyle's law stated that the pressure and volume inverse relationship, meaning to see the opposite to each other. The volume depends on the movement of the diaphragm and ribs and the pressure and airflow to the lungs. So we'll look into what is Boyle's law shortly. The Boyle's law describes the pressure and volume of a gas are inversely proportional, provided the temperature and the mass are kept constant, meaning to say the same. So as you can see on the left side of the picture, when there is high pressure, there is a low volume. But when there is a low pressure, there is a high volume in the canister. So what happened during inspiration and expiration, especially when we talk about the pressure changes and airflow? First, let's look into during the inspiration. So there will be contraction of muscles of inspiration, increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. So it will allow the lung, the chest area to expand to allow the volume to be filled up with air later will be more. And the increased thoracic volume will cause the lung to expand, as I've just mentioned. And this will further allow the alveolar volume increase. And when the alveolar pressure, which is inside the lung, is less than the atmospheric pressure, so the air from the atmospheric pressure will go into the alveoli during the inspiration. On the other hand, during expiration, the muscles are relaxed of the expiration, and it will decrease the volume of thoracic cavity. And when there is a decreased thoracic volume, it will produce a decrease in alveolar volume. So it's actually getting smaller. So the alveolar pressure will be more than the atmospheric pressure. So by principle, anything higher will goes up to the lower concentration. And because of this, the air from inside, which is from the alveoli, will goes outside to the atmosphere during expiration. So in short, what happened during pulmonary ventilation, which is during inhalation and exhalation? For you to remember better, try to remember one part, only one side of it, and the other part of it will be the opposite to the other. So for example here, looking at all the structures, what happened during inhalation, let's just talk about it. Okay, during inhalation, the external intercostal muscles will contract, Well, while the exhalation, during exhalation, it will relax. Internal intercostal muscles during inhalation will be relaxed. During exhalation, contract. The rib cage during inhalation will move upwards. During exhalation, it will move downwards. Diaphragm, it will be flattened during inhalation inferiorly, while during exhalation, it will be elevated and curved upwards, forming a dome. Thoracic volume will increase during inhalation. Exhalation will decrease. The pressure during inhalation will decrease. Exhalation will be increased. And the airflow, because of all this happening, during inhalation, it will goes into the lungs. During exhalation, the airflow out from the lungs. So this is the picture during breathing in and breathing out, inspiration and expiration. You can see the difference in terms of the structure. The chest expands during the breathing in, the ribs goes up, the diaphragm almost flattens, and the diaphragm contracts. And what about breathing out? It's the opposite to breathing in. Again, this is another illustration for you to understand how or what happened during inspiration and expiration. Moving on, respiration. So pulmonary ventilation, as you all know, is the air movement in and out. But respiration, by default, the meaning is different from pulmonary ventilation because respiration is where the gas exchange process, and it is divided into two, the external and internal respiration, which I already covered in the earlier and previous lecture. However, let's revise and talk about it again. External respiration is the movement of oxygen from the lungs to the blood and carbon dioxide from the blood to the lungs. So it occurs in the lungs most of the time, the blood and the lungs. And internal respiration, on the other hand, is the movement of oxygen from the blood to the cell interior, and from the cell it carries out the transfer out the carbon dioxide for it to be transported out from the cell and into the lungs via the blood. So gas transport refers to the mechanism by which oxygen and carbon dioxide are moved through the blood. Now move on. Let's talk about lung recoil. Lung recoil is very important because this is where it is the tendency for the lung to decrease in size. Now the lung decreases in size when its alveoli decreases in size, basically when the alveoli loses the air, and it causes for two reasons. One is because the alveolar walls are covered by this elastic fiber, okay, therefore allowing elastic recoil. And the second one is because of the surface tension of fluid that lines the alveoli. So there are two factors keeping the lungs from collapsing, not totally collapse, is the surfactant and also the pressure in the pleural cavity. Now let's look at how the lung recoil. So this is an example during the inhalation or inspiration. So the diaphragm moves downward, forcing air into the airways. Intercostal muscle contracts, enlarging the cavity even more. Membranes move with the contractions. The surface tension in alveoli and surfactant keep them from collapsing. Other muscles found in your chest region, which is your pectoralis minor and sternocleidomastoid at your neck region, can force a deeper breath, and therefore because of that, the first breath in newborn is the hardest because they have lack of surfactant because of the lung is not fully matured yet. Now moving on to the gas exchange. Gas exchange across the respiratory membrane is efficient due to several factors. The first one is the differences in partial pressure. It has to move from a high concentration to a lower concentration. Small diffusion distance, soluble gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide. There is a large surface of all alveoli, more and more air can go in and out. And also there is a good coordination of blood flow and air flow. So as you can see in this picture, you have external respiration and internal respiration. External respiration occurs in the lungs and in the blood, whereas the internal respiration is from in the blood and in the cells. And you can see on the right side of the picture, the alveoli of the lungs will have a higher concentration of oxygen, denotes with PO2 104 millimeters mercury, and this oxygen will enter into the lungs and carried out to the body in the blood via the pulmonary veins. Okay, as you can see, the red color lines there, and in the blood there is still higher concentration of oxygen until they reach into the capillaries, into the tissues, where the oxygen is transferred into the cells, and after that there is interchange between the capillaries. So the carbon dioxide will further being transferred out from the cells and going out to the lung via the pulmonary arteries, as you can see on the left side, line with the blue. Okay, and you can see that they will go back into the lung and being expelled to the air from the lung. So this is an illustration for you to show to you the gas exchange, where we have this alveolar blood capillary. In the alveolar cavity, there is a high pressure of oxygen. In the blood, there is low partial pressure of oxygen, and because there is a difference in the partial pressure, from a higher partial pressure will goes into a lower partial pressure, therefore the oxygen will move from the alveoli into the blood cells, in this case for gas exchange. So what are the differences between the partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the air of the alveoli and also in the blood capillaries? So you can also see, and how to remember is the one that you are remembering will be the opposite to the other one. So for gas oxygen, the pressure is higher in the air of the alveoli but lower in the blood capillaries, and therefore because of this, oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the blood capillaries, as I've actually mentioned earlier on. What about carbon dioxide? The carbon dioxide pressure in the alveoli is actually low, but in the blood capillaries is high, and therefore the carbon dioxide will diffuse from the blood capillaries back from the cells back into the blood capillaries and into the alveoli. Moving on to the next part of this session, which is the gas transport. The gas transport mainly involves oxygen and carbon dioxide. The blood transport oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and other tissues throughout the body, and these gases are carried in several different forms. They can be dissolved in the plasma or chemically combined with hemoglobin, Hb, or converted into different molecules. The first transport is oxygen. Now, it is carried mainly by red blood cells, RBCs, bound to hemoglobin. The amount of oxygen hemoglobin can be carried is dependent on the partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, pH, temperature. Even the fetal hemoglobin has a higher oxygen affinity than adult hemoglobin, meaning to say they can actually carry more or they need more oxygen than the adult, and the presence of carbon monoxide, CO. You need to know that the molecular oxygen is carried in the blood into two ways mostly. First is it bonds into hemoglobin Hb within red blood cells, about 98.5%, and they are called oxyhemoglobin, or another 1.5% they dissolve in plasma. So as you can see in this picture, the oxygen from lungs will actually transported on a red blood cell, okay, bound to hemoglobin, forming oxyhemoglobin. Then it is carried along the blood until it reaches the cells, tissue cells, and there the oxygen will be released to tissue cells, and there will be exchange. This time the red blood cells will actually carry carbon dioxide and bound to hemoglobin and become carboxyhemoglobin. Now, what about carbon dioxide transport? Carbon dioxide is transported in the blood in three forms. First, dissolved in plasma, 7%, chemically bound to hemoglobin, 23%, which is carried in RBC as carbaminohemoglobin. I'm sorry, it's actually not carboxy, it's carbaminohemoglobin. 70% is carried as a bicarbonate ion in plasma or carbonic acid in plasma used for buffer system. So this is the picture showing to you how carbon dioxide is carried on RBCs in plasma and also dissolved as carbonic acid or bicarbonate. So in summary of gas transport, gas exchange in human is driven by differences in partial pressure. The oxygen enters the blood at the lungs and lives in tissues, while the carbon dioxide enters the tissues and leaves the lungs. To sum up today's topic, the breathing mechanism involves two main processes: inspiration, or known as inhalation, and expiration, exhalation. The gas transport refers to the mechanism by which oxygen and carbon dioxide are moved through the blood. Finally, we have come to the end of this topic of today. The upcoming subtopics will include respiratory centers in the brain, what are the one controls the breathing, aging and respiratory system. And until then, thank you for your attention. I'll see you in the next session. Stay tuned and bye.